Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and tonight we'll be turning to a topic that's much in the news lately, and that is about privacy, large databases, data mining, and what it all means and what we can infer from it. Our guest tonight is Dr. Bamshad Mobasher, Professor of Computer Science at DePaul University. Bamshad, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
Let's start with a little bit of basic stuff for the people in the audience who read the newspapers and figure, what on earth are these guys talking about? We hear about data mining, metadata, all sorts of things, particularly in the context of what the National Security, the NSA is doing with Americans' data. So let's start with the concept. What is data mining? What's going on there?
Well, a lot of people refer to data mining, especially in the news. You know, you read articles about government doing data mining, businesses doing data mining, Facebook doing data mining, all of these different uses of the phrase data mining. But people often mean different kinds of things by that. So people, in common parlance, they sometimes refer to data collection, for example, as data mining. Ways of targeting information, they call it data mining. There's all sorts of different things. And all of that is true. All of that sort of falls into this general category of data mining. But people's concerns are in part about the way data is being collected, about the kinds of data that are being collected. And then once the data is collected, the question becomes what happens to that data and what comes out of that. In other words, what is the end result of that? And what kinds of things can be gleaned or discovered from that data that could either be used in positive ways to help people or could be used in other ways, for example, to potentially violate people's privacy.
Well, so if we think about what's been in the news lately about the NSA and all of the data collection that they do, and I'll come back to the idea of data collection in a minute, because that's the level of data collection that's happening today is so far beyond what has been possible before that gives these databases much more information. But the data mining itself, if I understand correctly, with the NSA, what they're doing is they're looking for connections. And is that what data mining does? It looks for connections that you may not even know exist, but it finds them anyway because of statistical correlation, essentially.
Right, that's a big part of it. So the ultimate goal, I mean, part of the goal is to find connections that are not obvious from just by observing. Part of it is also in general, to find patterns. But sometimes this could mean that you're trying to build kind of models that maybe predict something about the future. In fact, sort of predictive modeling, the idea of predictive modeling is sort of this long-standing kinds of tasks that are part of statistical analysis, part of data mining, part of what people refer to as machine learning. The basic idea is learn from the data, users' data, the data about items, about various objects, and then build some kind of a model that can predict something in the future. Good example of it is, credit card companies have for a long time used predictive modeling to try to predict whether someone is a good credit risk or a bad credit risk or something along those lines. So there's nothing really novel about the concept of predictive modeling. The difference today is that you're talking about much vaster amounts of information that people leave behind in their digital footprints, from purchases that they make online to Facebook, information that they put in, to tweets, for example, on Twitter, to website navigation, the trail they leave behind, to email trails and all sorts of things.
Well, in particular, cell phones, and I think this is where the outrage, or whatever outrage there was, about the NSA's data collection was about cell phone users. Almost everyone has cell phones now. It's just it's hard to imagine going through modern life without one. And so all of those calls conceivably can and possibly are being tracked by the NSA. So everything you do, every call you make to everyone, every call you receive is being tracked. And that's the impression we get from this NSA database, that they're collecting all of that. So that's a level of pervasiveness of everyday life that we haven't seen before in the government. There wasn't the capability to do that.
I think that's a good word. I think it's become pervasive. So data mining has become pervasive to a large extent, not just by NSA, but by every company that does really anything, right? From Walmart that looks at user transactions to Facebook that looks at user connections. And NSA, that's from what we know now, is that looking at really all of this stuff. So cell phone data is really a small part of it from what we understand now, right? So it started with Snowden, some of the things that were leaked showed that U.S. was looking at, was collecting large amounts of phone data, and what they call metadata. In other words, the phone numbers and who called who, basically, but not necessarily the contents. But some of the information that came out later from Snowden showed that they're actually doing a lot more than that. Not just looking at content, but looking at metadata at the level of website navigation, for example, what pages you went to, social connections on social networks, a lot of these other kinds of connections. So it's not just who you emailed or who you called, but also
when,
variety
how many
of other,
times,
when, how many times, who else is part of your network. And this networking is a very important part of this. Because of emergence of social networks, people discovered that you can, by mining the social network, you can discover quite a few things. Among other things, you could discover groups or communities of users or objects that are part of this network that show some kind of a connection or some kind of a pattern. Anybody who's on Facebook, there are tools on Facebook where you can look at your social graph, which shows you, for example, your connections, what are the clicks, for example, what are the different kinds of...
What are the strengths of connections, who do you communicate with more often than others?
And you can, in fact, visualize this very nicely on a graph where you have nodes and connections, and you can see that here is a large clump of people that seem to be very highly connected to each other. And if you look at that a little bit more carefully, it generally turns out that they have some common interests. Maybe they belong to the same group. Maybe they have the same kind of a political persuasion or a religious affiliation or whatever, right? Now imagine if your connections weren't just users and their friend connection on Facebook, but could be users, phone numbers, IP addresses, all sorts of different things that would be nodes on a graph. And the connections could be more than just friendship, could be who called who, could be who contacted who could be all sorts of other kinds of relationships.
Well, let me stop you for a moment on that. The amount of data that we're talking about here is absolutely enormous.
Yes.
I mean, if you think about what the NSA is trying to capture, and before the show we talked a little bit about the supposedly stopped program of a few years ago called Total Information Awareness, which apparently didn't stop. But that was the goal of TIA, which was to capture essentially all electronic data on the planet and process it somehow. How possible is that? I mean, we're talking about these gargantuan amounts of data from every conceivable aspect. So, for example, my bank account records, that's all electronic. How often do I log into my bank? What kind of transactions do I do? Conceivably, all of that can be captured. How can you possibly make sense of all that?
Yeah, all of that, in fact, is captured. And in fact, one of the things that was revealed in the New York Times article in late September was that, in fact, NSA was collecting all of this data and connecting them together, both offline databases, bank transactions, credit card information, DMV information, connecting all of that with all of the other data that they were getting from social networks and email providers and all of that, and connecting all of those together, so building this even more massive database. To answer your question, I think in the past, I would say less than a decade, there have been enormous advances in technology that has allowed companies to deal with much bigger amounts of information in one time. So there are platforms and there are frameworks and tools available that are much more adept in trying to sift through large amounts of information. And there are better tools for data mining that, because of work that's been done both in research and development in companies to really sift through this data and find patterns. So it's easier to make these connections.
Well, how often, though, might you get a false positive where there appears to be a connection, but there isn't one? I mean, with all of this massive amounts of data, you can imagine situations where random connections might seem to be much more important than they really are.
Yeah. Yes, and that's true, and this is where oversight comes in, right? if you're doing any kind of predictive modeling, that means you predict something using past information to predict something about the future. There is always some kind of an error rate, right? There are false positives, there are false negatives, and other kinds of errors that emerge from this. No model is going to be 100% accurate. Well, you could say, okay, well, these days we can build pretty good models that may be 95% accurate. That may be true. Generally, tools have developed so that you can build more sophisticated, more accurate models. But when you're talking about in the orders of hundreds of millions and maybe even billions of people, 5% error rate could mean a lot, right? So that's a waste of resources if you're thinking about it in those terms. But it also could put very innocent people in jeopardy. Maybe not necessarily their life being endangered, but
certainly
potentially
they could find themselves on a no-fly list for
that's
no
right.
reason.
At the very least, a lot of inconvenience, possibly being connected or being charged with things that they're not.
Being unable to get credit for various reasons. I mean, a lot of things could happen and go
wrong.
wrong.
Lots of things.
And it seems that there's part of this that seems very frightening, because it's essentially this vast machine that's gathering the data, analyzing the data, and spitting out these predictive results,
right,
or predicted results. And it's hard to know in this vast machinery where the error exists. So if you as an individual look at that and say, well, I'm not this person they think I am. I shouldn't have been denied this bank loan. I should be able to fly. I shouldn't be stopped by the police. I shouldn't be stopped at the border as I go over to Mexico or Canada. There's not much recourse, because this seems like it's so automated. There aren't necessarily people you can appeal to.
It's not just automation. I think it's a lack of transparency is a part of it. So as you said, if someone finds himself or herself in that kind of a position, there are no obvious places you can go to or write to or appeal to that to say that I think this is wrong. And you don't necessarily even know that you are being considered for surveillance or maybe being looked at more carefully. And I think that's part of the problem with this whole discussion, is not necessarily the data collection part or even the data mining part, but what are the what is the oversight mechanism? What are the why is it not there is no transparency involved in determining who is being targeted and who is not. The targeting, in fact, what we have learned is that expanded dramatically, even more so under the Obama administration. So it used to be that if the links that you were considering in this network reached a U.S. person, somebody in the U.S., then that would stop. The surveillance would stop,
they would need a warrant at any
then
rate,
they would have to get a warrant to consider that one person. That rule has changed right now. So long as at some point in the link, you have some kind of a foreign entity. An entity could mean not necessarily even a person. It could be some other node in this graph. Then it's legitimate to look at that U.S. person as well and collect the information. And the most recent information shows that vast amounts of information are being collected from web traffic of U.S. individuals, from social network connections, from a variety of other sources. Some of that, by the way, we were talking about predictive modeling. Another side of data mining is sort of unsupervised, what we call unsupervised or sort of untargeted kinds of knowledge discovery, where you are essentially trying to find patterns that you don't know necessarily exist. So you're not building a model to predict things, you're just trying to see what kind of patterns emerge in the data. Does a particular community or group emerge out of a social network associated with a person? Is there a cluster of people or organizations that seem to have connections to each other? That kind of stuff.
So all of this reminds me of a movie. I think the name of it was Minority Report with Tom Cruise, where the government has reached a point where they can use this predictive modeling to predict that you're going to commit a crime sometime in the future before you even do it, and will arrest you and imprison you based on that predictive modeling. It's science fiction, but all fiction has at its core some grain of truth. What do you think about this? I mean, I realize that you're a computer scientist and this is political philosophy, but nonetheless, you're very deeply involved in data mining and this kind of technology. Is it possible we could get to a point like that?
Well, part of that is technological. Part of the kind of world we describe is technological. The ability to be able to observe and track people and then be able to essentially model them, right? So that's kind of modeling. So one type of individual may be more prone to certain kinds of activity, and you can measure that with some degree of probability. And in fact, this is what we are doing now, right? So there's nothing, that part of it has really been realized. When Amazon give you a book recommendation or you see a targeted advertising come your way, it's because a system was able to essentially profile you and model you and then target something to you based on your perceived habits and interests, right? Something that is based on a prediction that you will like or you would purchase that item. So there's not that far to go from there and the ability to predict whether you will commit a murder or something along those lines. The other part of it is the political side, is the question of, okay, if you have that knowledge, even if you have some high probability that somebody will take some particular action, what do you do with that knowledge, right?
Right.
And that's where I think constitutional issues come in, issue of oversight, an issue of legal aspects of it, privacy come in.
Because the argument for taking action would be the argument made immediately after the attacks of 9/11, where the consensus really amongst all Americans was, if you had known this was coming, you could have and should have stopped it. So there would be a case where you would say, well, of course they should step up because something like 9/11 could have been prevented had they been able to get this predictive modeling then, which, as you remember, is the genesis of the total information awareness and what we see now. It was the idea that they were not connecting the dots, so now they are connecting the dots. So it seems to me that we are in this position where the technology is racing far ahead of the general awareness in the populace and certainly of the political argument, so that these things are happening already. To the point where we're really not even aware enough of them to have the discussion about what's appropriate. So is there a responsibility on the part of, well, even someone like yourself who's involved in creating some of this technology, to try to make the public more aware of this and to try to foster that conversation?
I believe there is. I think people who are involved in developing these kinds of technology and companies that are involved in using and proliferating this kind of technology, I think they should have a responsibility, if not a moral responsibility, a civic responsibility to tell people what this technology can be used for. And just like any technology, it's possible to use it in good ways and also in bad ways. My work involves essentially doing similar kinds of things, but for the purpose of helping people find information, or targeting the right kinds of information to the people, or helping them find things that they might like in vast amounts of information. But that same technology, it can be used to do other kinds of things, including target people for investigation, for instance. Now, that's not necessarily bad, right? If the government has the tools and the capability to try to find terrorists who potentially may cause harm to other people, well, then they should do so. The question becomes, are there sufficient legal frameworks and infrastructure and safeguards to protect people that might otherwise get caught up into this vast network, right? So I think some of the questions are technological, but I think the gap really that exists here is about legal frameworks and the political understanding of really what the total impact of some of these technologies.
Thinking about this, and given the rate at which technology accelerates, for those who are technologically minded, they probably have heard of Moore's Law, which talks about hardware, but the idea of Moore's Law is that computing power per dollar spent doubles every 18 months. But certainly software capabilities follow a similar curve. So technology in general is the accelerating at an accelerating rate. So given that, how does the public keep up with that acceleration at an accelerating rate? How is it even possible for people, or the laws, for example, to keep up with this accelerating rate of technological change?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer because you know, part of the, in my opinion, part of what was good about the revelations that we saw in Snowden and you know other people who have come forward to say really to what degree you know information is being collected and mined, is that we've understood really what the extent of this is. So people have a much broader knowledge of what's really happened if they have been paying attention. On the other hand, it's had this ironic, I guess, effect of people sort of becoming, you know,
inured to it.
That's right.
It off.
They sort of understand it as to be just the status quo. Of course, we are being, you know, surveilled and monitored, and so you know.
There's red light cameras everywhere. Of course, they're watching me.
That's right, and a lot of people in this country don't see anything wrong with that necessarily. The problem, of course, becomes once somebody is affected by the result of it, then they would see that differently. But it's hard to go from that point A to point B to try to get people to be concerned enough to really maybe talk to their elected officials, for instance.
Well, let's talk about the individual for a moment. With Facebook and just being the most obvious social networking site, but with the advent of social media, with the advent of almost all businesses moving to the web, and with the seeming unconcern of people about leaving the trails you talked about, many of which are inadvertent. You know, if I think about going shopping I'm not thinking about, well, gee, who's tracking that? Who's keeping information on me? You know, who's correlating that? How much do people need to mature in their understanding of how much the new technology has changed the very questions about what it means to lead a private life, what it means to be an individual? You know, how do individuals react to that? And is there any way that they can affect what's known about them, or is this already a fait accompli?
I think part of the problem is that our expectation of privacy, there's a big gap between our expectation of privacy and the actual privacy that we have compared to, let's say, 50 years ago, right? 50 years ago, if government wanted to conduct surveillance on you, there'd be some agent sitting outside of your
sitting in an unmarked
house,
car,
maybe
right,
looking through the window or maybe following you with a car. And if even now, if somebody notices something like that, they would be extremely disturbed, right? But if you're sitting at home and browsing the web and looking at various websites, maybe some of them, you know, things that might be embarrassing.
You wouldn't want your children to know about.
That's right. Your perception is that you're sitting alone, there's nobody around, right? So your perception of privacy that you have, your expectation of privacy is much higher than the privacy you actually have because you are being tracked. And now we know that it's not just the companies that you're visiting their website that be tracking you, or ad networks that are tracking you. There are actually NSA and government agencies that are tracking you potentially. So there is in fact even more eyes on you than the 50 years ago when you know, you had physically people monitoring
vastly
you.
More.
A
vastly
lot more.
more.
That's right. And a lot more of your kinds of activity are being monitored. And many more connections are being made, you know, in terms of the kinds of behavior that you engage in. But we don't feel that way because often we are doing those things in private,
or
physically.
we feel that we're doing it in private.
That's right. So I don't know if that gap will ever be filled, but there is this gap, and I think that's partly responsible for people not reacting more negatively to some of these.
Well, one of
stories.
there's actually a brand new novel just released that I have not yet had a chance to read. You may have heard about, called The Circle. And
I've heard about it.
The premise is a large Silicon Valley company it's a novel, so it's fiction, but it's essentially a conglomeration of Yahoo and Google and Facebook and all the major players rolled into one. And this company really controls all of the data that's flowing through. And much like the NSA does today, they gather every bit of information about everyone. And their company mottos come down to a couple of simple truths, like, you know, privacy is lying. And the essential idea being, if you've got something private, you're hiding something and you're not being a good citizen. And one plot line in the novel apparently is that politicians are required to wear essentially what's like Google Glass. They wear these things that track their every move and their every conversation. And politicians who refuse to do that are seen as being unscrupulous and necessarily corrupt. And so all politicians end up having this incredibly invasive kind of monitoring of their lives. And there are probably some Americans who would say, gee, I'd love it if my congressman had to track everything he or she did. But is that world possible? Is that world something that
I think we are partly there. Certainly in terms of politicians, these days, they're all on Twitter, they're all on Facebook, they're all, a lot of them are being, if you're important enough, being monitored by TV cameras. Almost everything is being recorded, even by individuals in an audience. So almost nothing goes undetected. You say something, you do something, people are going to know about it if you're a public official. We see that, daily in, footage that somebody recorded and put on Facebook. Not just politicians, it's just this recent news story about a faculty member someplace, a professor somewhere that posted something or sent an email to students in a class about that has some political content to it, talking about how the government shutdown caused by the Tea Party Republicans resulted in them not being able to access Bureau of Labor Services to use some data for their project. So that went viral because one of the students sort of sent it out, and then right-wing blogs started blogging about it. And that professor got, I don't know what's happened to it, got in trouble or not. But so almost nothing that you do these days is, even if the government is not monitoring it, it's being recorded in some way. And so much of the information that NSA is collecting is not necessarily information that you would think is private. It's public information. At least, it's public in some particular forum, but you don't expect it to be to have such a reach as information does now.
So does that mean essentially that we just give up the idea of having a private life?
I think to a large extent that's what it has meant. I don't think people think that they have given up their private life, but any email that you send, is forever digitally recorded somewhere.
Yes, nothing ever dies on the internet.
And that's right. Any video that you record, it's going to remain there. But more than that, websites, your record of visits to websites, your record of, posting on the blogs, and all of those things are going to remain there and become part of your permanent digital footprint that could be connected to other kinds of activity.
Well, the good news is that this show, now that we're out of time, will live forever on the web, right? It will never go away.
That's true.
Well, Bamshad, thank you so much for coming back, and I hope you'll come back and visit us again.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19 and see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. Till next time, thank you and good night.
Thank you.